Reverend responses before following.
Okay, I think the interesting point is that, as I had mentioned earlier, we have to look at religion, because when we are, question is, how can religion make a difference in the life of a nation? And there are so many factors that affect it. It becomes very complicated. But one thing I'm quite convinced and sure, just because a politician say it doesn't mean it's religiously true. That I am convinced. It doesn't matter which religion. It can be even Obama saying something that's in the spirit of Christianity, but we can disagree because the thing that drives politician is power. And therefore I ask you this question. Think about it very carefully. Which politician or political party or people in power will engage and exercise their power in such a way that it will give them less power, deregulate their power? Of course not. Nowhere in this world, from the time when you had primitive societies until this day, those who were in power would use every means to keep that power. And one of the things they can use to keep that power is religion, by whatever name. Kings in Europe have used Christianity. Hindu leaders in India have used their religion, Islam, and so on and so forth. And I think that is the point we have to keep, and that's the tension. Oscar Romero had this to say, and he was a revolutionary Christian immersed in liberation theology in Latin America. So he said, when I say that as Christians we all must love and care for the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask, why are they poor, they call me a communist. And I think there's a deep truth in this. We have to ask the question, why there is discrimination? Why there is so much poor in this country? Why is there a huge gap between the rich and the poor? And who is holding the power to keep this gap, either as it is or even to grow to the benefit of those who have power? Why certain sectors of society are stigmatized and suspicion is drawn to them, that somehow because of their condition, their religion, or their community or ethnic affiliation, they are condemned to be like that? These are the hard questions that religious people have to ask, because religious people, I would think, are not interested in politics in the bad sense. We are interested in true transformation inspired by the teachings of our faith. And we have in each of our religions examples of that. And we must be a force of good. And the force of good comes by exemplary life and making choices and options in society. So it's very difficult for a rich church to say we should care for the poor because they are rich. They will always be rich. And they'll always feel good they're helping the poor. But they would not want to change the conditions so that the poor will not be poor for all the time. That is the point. And I think if we draw inspiration from all the great leaders of our faith, we have so many beautiful examples that showed that even the voice of one, so focused, so determined, not to be tempted by the temptation of power, can make a difference that will inspire millions around the world. And it does not even have to be from the same faith community. Today, as young people, many of us find inspiration in Mahatma Gandhi, in Mother Teresa, in Oscar Romero, in Nelson Mandela. And we are glad that they are inspired by their religion and have kept the cause. And so, I think if religion can ever play a positive role, and of course, in our situation, we have to take into cognizance that there are power relations between parties that are existing, but we have to take that road of being a force of good and building human solidarity. Is there hope for interfaith joint action? Yes. I only know that every effort, brothers and sisters, every effort is being made to keep us separate. Because if religions inspired by their ideals for compassion, love, caring, sharing come together, those in power get very scared. And they would not want it. They like Muhibah party. They like formal things that show that we're all sitting together at the table. But they don't like real grassroots movement of the force of good by the people of goodwill and of faith. What?
It's always hard to follow up a speech after a preacher just spoke, because yeah, practice every weekend. No, but thank you. That's just really, really moving and really, really so beautifully put. The relationship between democracy, faith, and politics is very intricate. And I think in thinking about that, we should start with what it is that we want, right? What is the goal of a democracy? Sadly, in Malaysia, because there's so much work that needs to be done to improve the state of a democracy, the meaning of democracy is still stuck to elections. Whereas in more advanced democracies, election is just a means. Right? It's the means of giving the people a voice. But the real goal of democracy is not just even giving the people a voice, actually empowering the people. Democracy functions well when we can clearly see that the people are empowered. So what institutional forms that could take is a longer debate, but primarily what we aim for when we say we want democracy is that it is the people that are in control of their destiny. And a good way to have a sense of what this means is through the phrase that our brother Reverend just used, the fullness of life, right? Or I prefer the Malay word, kebahagiaan. We know that democracy is working when we see kebahagiaan. Right? We don't see racial tensions, we don't see ethnic politics, we don't see gender chauvinism, right? That everybody has a sense that their life is theirs, right? And that they're in control, and that the politicians serve them. So that's the ideal. The reality in Malaysia, as we all know, is that should there be a day when power is really at the hands of the people, we will have to envision a state of affairs whereby that power is shared across religious and racial lines. We don't know what that will look like, because it's never happened. Right? It's never happened where economic power, state power is not dominated by only certain interested parties. Right? So our political imagination must be geared towards envisioning what power sharing might look like. And in this, it might be the case that power sharing might not need power. Power sharing must begin with the fact that we must be ready to be vulnerable with one another. That we must be able to be free to speak of our fears, of our hopes, as a member of a certain ethnicity or a certain religion, and how we can, one another, contribute towards a shared Malaysia. Because we can't talk about racism, we can't talk about fundamentalism, fanaticism, right, if we're not ready to be vulnerable with one another. Right? So what would that take? And this, this is a bigger question than what this panel can handle, but I do want to suggest us to envision what it would need for us to feel safe for me to speak as a Malay Muslim, to hear the grievances of my Christian or Hindu brother, and from there to figure out, well, how can we work together? What are the issues? What are the fault lines? Where do we converge? Where do we diverge? Indonesia, for all of its problems, is a good example because they're more used to a culture of creolizing and mixing. Right? Whereas if you go to Bali or Georgia, you can see sort of Hindu elements in the Hindu residual elements of paganism, animism in their sort of ways of dress, in their music, in their language, or in their appreciation of Islam. Whereas in Malaysia, you find all these communities as sort of airtight spaces, right? We kind of interact maybe at the mall or something, but in most everyday conditions, we don't really have that sort of experience. And one example that I think Muslims can turn to is the fact that Islam itself, because it's dynamic, managed to adopt pagan influences and Jewish traditions in its practices as well. Fasting was a Jewish practice, right? Muhammad, before circumcision, before the prayer was directed to Mecca, it was directed to Jerusalem, where the direction that the Jews prayed. Right? The crescent symbol is a pagan symbol as well. There was no problem to this because the Prophet, peace be upon him, was of the conviction that God created nations and tribes so that you can learn from one another. Right? There's not this bunker mentality where you feel that religion has to be a shield for your insecurities. Right? If you have faith in humanity, if you trust humanity, if you see the happiness of others as much a part of the divine plan as your own happiness, right? Then you can begin to envision a space where we can all speak freely. Right? And that, I think, should be the indicator, right? The fact that we can be vulnerable to one another should be the indicator of the fact that democracy is working in Malaysia. Because unless we get there, then it's just all procedural, all technical, and all hollow.